Hello, hello. Welcome to this week's live Monday Music Motivation. I hope everybody had a fantastic weekend and is ready to have a fantastic week of practicing. For today's little bit of motivation and inspiration, I wanted to talk about this idea that I first heard about in the book called Make It Stick by a couple of researchers and an author who helped them write it. Make It Stick is a fairly popular book in terms of kind of learning science, and it doesn't talk about the relationship to music hardly at all. There might be one or two examples about learning music in there, but it's definitely not about learning music. It's more about learning science in general, and is kind of a narrative summary, lightly narrative, pretty research heavy, but it's a summary of a bunch of different research studies on learning and kind of what constitutes effective learning. And one of the ideas in there is this idea of the illusion of mastery. And it's kind of that idea of taking your textbook chapter that you're studying for and just rereading it over and over and over and over again. And what that does for you is it makes you feel like you know what the chapter is about, because you've basically have the chapter more or less memorized, or at least you've encountered the information of the chapter, and you can confidently read it and you can move through those words and you know what you're doing. But they find in the research that even though you know the chapter, you don't actually know the material that the chapter is covering, and you're not able to recall that information or retrieve that information when you're tested on it very effectively. The kind of opposite of the illusion of mastery would be the testing effect, where instead of rereading the textbook over and over, instead you test yourself on the information and kind of find the gaps in your knowledge and figure out how to have a deep enough understanding of the material that you can kind of engage with it at a little bit deeper level, like you would need to for a test or for writing an essay about the topics or for contributing further to that research, depending on kind of what level you're working at, of course. So I think that is a fairly intuitive idea. If you're somebody who studies just by reading the textbook over and over and over, this might be kind of game-changing information for you. A much better thing to do would be to make flashcards or do practice quizzes or things like that. But I think what's interesting is it seems fairly intuitive that, like, yeah, when you're studying for a test, you shouldn't just reread and reread and reread. However, we do that a whole lot in our practice, where we just redo and redo and redo and just come back to it and be like, okay, this is the material I'm practicing. I practiced this yesterday. I'm going to practice it today in basically the same way, and just redo it and redo it and redo it. And this creates the illusion of mastery. And what I want to talk about today are the indicators of kind of pointless practice or illusion of mastery practice versus actually productive practice that's going to make things stick for the long term and yield more confident performances. So the illusion of mastery, or the pointless practice, is what I just described, where you're just rereading the textbook, you're just taking that section that's hard and you're playing it again today over and over and over, and then you come back to it the next day and you play it again over and over and over, and then you come back to it the next day and you play it again over and over and over. And this absolutely creates that illusion of mastery, and you feel like you know the passage, because in your individual practice session, if you look at just one day, you go from not being able to play it very well, or it's kind of sloppy to start with, and then it gets better and better and better as you do those repetitions and build it up. And by the end of that first day, you're able to play it fairly reasonably and it feels pretty good. And then you come to it the next day, and again, it starts kind of rough and kind of shaky, and then you build it up, and by the end of the session, you're like, yeah, I'm pretty happy with how that went. And then you come to it the next day, and it's kind of same thing. You build it up, you're pretty happy with how it went. And then you get to the performance, and you're not happy with how it went. And you're like, oh, I played this better so many times in practice, but now it's not going better. And that's because you never played it better than your performance on the first time in practice. And when you do a performance, even if you're warming up beforehand, unless the difficult section is the very first part of the piece and you're playing it literally 30 seconds before you walk out on stage, and even at that, because you have to walk out on stage, you have to engage with the audience, and there's enough distraction to kind of forget, it's still going to be more of forgetting than when you've played rep, 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 rep. That was a good rep. So probably in no circumstance of performing do you get that satisfaction and that ability to fully warm it up and get to that level of mastery that you do when you're doing the rep, 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 improve, 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 improve. Okay, now that's a rep that I'm happy with. So the moral of this story is that if you're feeling good in your practice, at the end of the day of practice, you're like, oh, now I'm playing it exactly how I want. And you did rep, 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 rep before you could get it to the level that you wanted, then that's not going to stick. And that's the illusion of mastery. And it feels like you've mastered it, but it's an illusion because you need 5, 10, 20 repetitions of building it up before you reach that level of mastery. Now, the flip side of that kind of perfect practice is, or more productive practice, is where you're digging into it, you're working out the kinks, you're solving problems, and in that day of practice, you probably won't get it up to tempo. You may be doing weird dotted rhythms and practice rhythms and other kind of contextual interference exercises, so it doesn't exactly sound like the end goal that you want it to be. But you know that you've mentally engaged with it a lot and you've made progress on it and things are feeling better and things are feeling more comfortable within that particular practice session. But you maybe haven't worked with it enough to get it to that kind of performance level that you were doing in your pointless practice. And in the pointless practice, it feels better on the day because you got it going really well. But in the more productive practice, you're more mentally engaged with it and it feels kind of mentally taxing. So this is one of the indicators that you're doing good productive practice, is that your brain is getting tired faster than your fingers or your hands or your embouchure, and you feel kind of mentally fatigued at the end of practice. It may not be sounding like you want it to sound in the performance necessarily. You may not have it up to tempo yet, but your brain is tired from working on it. Then the next day you come back to it and suddenly it's feeling a lot easier and it's a lot more comfortable. And then you do that same kind of really breaking it down, really kind of making every repetition of it feel novel through different contextual interference exercises, and you're continuing to find desirable difficulty on it. And again, your brain is really tired and it's maybe a little bit closer to how you want it to go in the performance, but it's still not necessarily feeling performance ready, and you haven't done multiple reps that are like, if that's how it went in the performance, then I'd be happy about it, because you're doing contextual interference reps where you're changing it up, you're starting in different places, you're thinking about it, you're making mistakes, you're fixing more mistakes. And if you stop and think about it, this is actually really valuable because you're fixing mistakes. And that's another indicator of really productive practice, is that you're actually fixing things and more tangibly fixing things. It's not just that it's kind of getting better after you do many, many reps, but you're actually intentionally targeting things and solving those problems. And then the last indicator is you'll take maybe a day off from playing that piece, or maybe just a few days off from playing in general, and then you come back to it and it somehow got better. And that's probably the most telltale sign that you're doing really good practice, is that even when you're not practicing, somehow it's still getting better. And if you've never experienced really productive practice, then you've probably never really experienced this, because when you're doing pointless practice, every time you come back to it, you've lost it because you haven't practiced storing it in long-term memory and retrieving it from long-term memory. That's the missing thing in pointless practice. In pointless practice, in your working memory, in your kind of short-term, that in that moment, you've made a lot of improvement and it feels really satisfying. And that's where the idea of the illusion of mastery comes from, is you feel satisfied in the moment, but it doesn't stick in the long term. The converse to that with productive practice, it feels a little less satisfying. It gets really satisfying as you get more practice with it and you get used to that getting satisfaction from the mental engagement and the discovering of problems or opportunities for improvement. So it feels a little less satisfying in the moment, but gets way, way better over the long term and as you take breaks. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions about that in the comments. It's a little abstract for sure. But before we wrap up the live Monday music motivation, don't forget to fill out your practice template. You can get it at quickstartclarinet.com/get-started, or just copy it with the date for the week, reflection of how things are going, what your goal to accomplish this week is, and then your plan for when you're going to make it happen and what you're going to do at those times. And then, as always, take that plan, put it in your calendar, set reminders, do whatever you need to do to make it happen. And as you're practicing this week, think about that mindset of not pointless practice. I'm not trying to give myself the illusion that I have mastered anything. It doesn't need to sound exactly the way that I want it to go today, up to tempo, all of those things. I just need to be pursuing opportunities for improvement, meeting myself where I am, and making a small step in the right direction through heavily mentally engaged practice, and trust that over time that's going to sink in and get a whole lot better. So I hope that you have a fantastic week of practicing this week. Again, let me know if you have any questions about this kind of abstract stuff in the comments, and have a fantastic week. I'll see you next week on the